like Stan, I have to say, I was Michael's thesis student as well, and now I'm deploying all the strategies he used to try and get me to work with my thesis students. So I did learn a lot from you, Michael. How to be patient one week, and how to lose your tempo the next week. All those strategies. I remember that now. I appreciate it. It's very interesting to revisit the Portland building, which was, or has become sort of one of the big symbols of this shift to postmodernism as being a style that's very visible in the U.S. Is this civic building that was done in that style. And I think that there's, well, I mean, I have a lot of questions that I want to put on the table. I also do want to leave time for the audience to ask questions, so I'll just go ahead and start with some questions to you. I mean, I think that part of what this was for you was, as you showed in your contextualizing the competition for you, is that it was a critique of normative modernism around the site there. A critique of the glass box, a critique of buildings that neglected the street. Now, by this time, I will say the modernism in Portland itself had already become sort of symbolic. I mean, it was a second generation modernism, it was normative modernism. But your critique was a critique through symbolism, through referential abstraction, through techniques of turning to imagery and figuration. And I guess one of the things that I'd like you to talk a little bit more about is, as a competition, and I think in the original talk, you talk a little bit more about just how tight the budget was, how difficult the competition was to get, to come in under budget, and how many compromises you went through to sort of make sure that you were able to deliver this building. But I guess one question would be, how do you toe this line between a form of compromise to get the commission and maintaining this this desire to create a symbolic language? So what happened is that through the iterations, as we saw the symbolism, the language flattens and becomes more and more abstract. And at what point is there a line that became problematic for you or not?
I think it's mostly or not. I knew that I'm a realist in the sense that I knew I couldn't afford that. I knew that I couldn't have a freestanding column wall here or anything. I knew that it all had to be back against the surface. I knew that I could, in a building like that, unlike, let's say, a house, describe the face of the building with slight variations, indentations. In a house, let's say, if you're trying to adhere to a very strict budget, it would mean that the foundations were going to move with that. But here I was building a concrete pile upon which the tower sat. And therefore, I could move that back and forth a bit. Because the interior square footage couldn't absorb big spaces, couldn't absorb anything outrageous. And today, some architects would just simply say, no, this won't do that. But for somebody who still went behind the years and who needed the experience, I was very happy to get to try that kind of abstraction, which I should say I have been working with for years in painting. A teacher of mine, Colin Rowe, said once, 3 dimensions is easy. It's 2 dimensions that are difficult. And I like that in that the 2 dimensions, reading is 3D or whatever, is partly what painting is about, or something. and it was and is for me. And therefore, I wasn't without practice in that kind of thing, that kind of imagery.
What it did, I think, two things. One, it took a project that was sort of more historically linguistic and made it more abstract, which I think was an interesting sort of conversation then with the abstractions that you were critiquing across the street. So it makes, I think, it actually turns the building into an interesting transition from high modernism or second generation modernism to postmodernism. It actually works well as a hinge in that way. But it also, the more you flatten, the more you turn the building into an image and into a spectacle or an image or, well, let's say an image. And I think that leads to really the sort of question of legibility of what it means to turn this public building into an image. And I know your critique of spectacular architecture since then. So what about that issue in terms of sort of at what point does the flattening turn the two-dimension of the building, turn it into a question of image as opposed to...
We're using image as something negative.
Right.
Image is there no matter what. But if you want me to comment on it, turning it into something, an image that is negative and paper thin.
I think into, well, that would, I guess, be the question. Is, does it turn it into, or were you anxious at the time of it turning into, let's say, a superficial image and being provoked by that?
No, in fact, I found it just the opposite, quite honest, in that at the time Peter Eisenman was starting to talk about cardboard architecture, and because with our budgets in those days, that's what we had to work with. So how to deal with that question, and in a sense, if I could be a little bit crass, to paint it on, wasn't all that much of a reach for me. I was on the campus this weekend and passed by Wu Hall. I've never understood that little symbolism above the door, the circles and pediments, but in a way, with real materials, he paints it on. And it makes you think about depth in a way that real depth wouldn't have given you. However, if I had been given 3 or 4 times the budget, I probably wouldn't have done it this way. Yeah, it was this exercise that caused me to do it this way. And I refused to make the glass box.
Right.
And I was thinking today about coming here tonight and about an invitation I had from a student of mine here at Princeton. And she had just gotten a job at SOM. And she invited me to lunch and she wanted to catch up. And she wanted me to see what she was working on. She was very proud of it. And there was a piece of blue colored paper, which was a rectangle, on her desk. And then mapmaker's tape on it, vertical and horizontal lines. And she said, my job is to make a series of these with different sizes mapmaker tape, because that's what we have to work with today. So I'm not sure that's true, but I thought how impoverished that life was. If I only knew how the Orbango building was made, you know, I'd get that vomit, but I didn't go. So.
What about, I mean, as the building flattens and turns into an image, what about the question of public legibility, which I think is also something that generally is important to you, and something that Stan mentioned in his introduction, the question of, let's say, an accessibility of your buildings without them being lowbrow populist. There is a form of populism at play. Can you speak a little bit to the legibility of, once you do start to extract something and flatten, when you have an exaggerated flattened capital, when you have the garlands that become more flattened, legibilities, what sort of registers are you working towards with an audience in that building, or in any building, even the Arts Council building here?
I used to give a talk here called Telling Stories. And I think, for me, the whole affair of architecture, music, whatever it is in the arts, gets ever so much richer. And this is so obvious, it's silly to say it. The more you know. Therefore, in terms of the populist argument, in fact, when Stan was introducing me, he said something about Michael's work for Target being accessible. And if Peter Eisman were here tonight, Peter and I are good friends, but he would say that's a populist remark. But, and there are easy comebacks with Peter because of the arcane nature of his secrets in his buildings. But they do make the life of a building more interesting once you're willing to play that game. Now, I don't subscribe to the comments that people make that today we can't have a Doric column because we don't know what it means. We can find out what it means if you're interested. Most people are not. Most people don't do it. But I thought, given the strict characteristic of this box that I had to make, and wanted to make, but I had no choice but to make it the best I could, that the relief of that, the literal relief of the garlands on the side when they were made of copper, would have been quite charming and quite interesting. The city council, you'd be interested to know, it was the one thing they couldn't abide by, but they said I could have it. It was the contractor who said I couldn't. But they said you can have it because we don't want to be in the position of destroying, work of art or whatever they thought it was. And because we don't know, we're just not sure about it. Because it had no meaning to them. But if people now in school in Portland find out the story of Portlandia, or the story of garlands, or the story of a column, or what is rustication, or what is all this stuff, I think architecture becomes ever so much more interesting, if not more meaningful. I would take issue with your word image. As I look across at Nakash Hall, it's an image. It's much deeper. It's got buttresses and interesting things that would make the play of light and shadow. That's an image. It's just not a two-dimensional image.
Right, and that was the point I was getting to, was with the different iterations, and I think it showed up very well in the lecture, the image of the building does start to get very close to two dimensions. And I think that given today's sort of media culture and the sort of world of the spectacle that we live in, and my knowing your criticism of the sort of spectacle of architecture, I think that this sort of tension of that project becoming more sort of dancing with the dangers of the two-dimensional image and what that does to architecture is more what I was getting at. I agree, every building has an image, and that, especially a public building with its legibility, plays on that image, and that's desirable.
But remember that the toys in my sandbox were things that Portland's made of. Bases and columns and tiles and tripartite organizations and so on. They weren't whatever, crooked columns and buildings upside down and all that. They had a resonance, if you're willing, in the town. And it's interesting today in Portland, I know everybody's from Portland, but I say this, is that somehow the building kind of fits in now. It's not such a big deal anymore. It's the Portland building, It's not, the trees have grown up and labeled the way they will with Frank's book.
interested in that you mentioned Venturi almost the first thing and the importance of contradiction. And there are similarities in your thinking, but there are also differences.
Huge.
Yeah, and again, especially if this whole sort of question of flatness has been brought up. And I guess, I mean, there's sort of two parts to this question. I mean, one is just maybe to push a little bit to talk about what those differences are. And also that Venturi's critique, I mean, if the target of your critique was tending more towards the banality of the glass box, Venturi's critique was also directed at a kind of elaborated sculptural late modernism. And so, you know, he was arguing in favor of, in a sense, in favor of sort of flatness and the decorated shed and so on, which wouldn't necessarily quite be your argument, but I guess if you could talk a little bit more about the points of agreement, points of disagreement.
Point of agreement, and I don't know, Sarah, whether you do this in your course or not, but it's almost too simple for words, but you heard the Venturi, I hope, the Venturi dictum of the decorated shed that Stan just used, and the duck. For those of you who don't know what that means, is that out on Long Island, there is a little shed that sells ducks. Duck meat, or did. It sells hot dogs now. We could say there's a green building that looks like a hot dog. And they sell hot dogs or ducks. And I'm reminded of a story that I wish I knew the characters, because they're characters out of Hollywood that we all know, but one of them said, when told he wouldn't be able to put a restaurant in a certain place, he said, oh yes, I could. I could make this restaurant out of anything. In fact, we looked back at his family and he said, like your hat, I could make it look like a brown derby. And he said, well, what makes you think that you could make people come to a brown derby? He said, the food. But that's one way. And the curiosity, obviously. It's not going to destroy the city unless today everything's a brown derby. That's the problem today, one of the problems, urban problems today. Everything is a curiosity. So there goes the street. And the other is the decorated shed. Now, it would be hard to say that the Parthenon is a decorated shed, but it is. It's a box with a certain kind of column, a certain kind of pediment, with decoration. It's got sculpture in the pediments, it's got sculpture on top of the columns, but it's a simple rectangular form. It's not in the form of something else. And what Venturi's big contribution is that when Venturi wrote his book, it was the time of brutalism. And his axe was being ground, I think, on buildings like the one that's now in the news at Yale, Paul Rudolph's, of the Arts and Architecture building, where Rudolph, I never think of Rudolph's building as being brutalist, but the press did. But heavy concrete and heavy concrete structure that's generally expressed. Great big walls, columns, things that are holding up these fragile institutions. And he was very much against that kind of expression, and he called that a duck, no matter whether it was a box or not, because it was expressive of something outside of architecture. It was expressive of the technology of architecture. And there are all ways to build the building. You can build it out of steel, you can build it out of concrete, you can build it out of a lot of stuff. But that was a selection on the architects of the 60s. I guess I've got a decade, right? 60s to do that sort of thing, and they did it in spades. I mean, they really, it was heavy at that time. And Venturi's reaction was partly to that. But I learned a lot just from that little stupid little phrase, Dr. Decorated Shed. In your own work, in my own work, looking at what you're doing and thinking about when you're trying to do something in 3 dimensions, does it start to have a kind of characteristic of going too far, getting to be a little bit like.
Well, I think that part of Stan's question actually gets to a question that's kind of at the heart of this whole, there's a whole series of talks that the Architectural League wants to do based on these lectures that they're reissuing on postmodernism. And I think sort of one basic question that might be very helpful for the audience is for you to just define what you think postmodernism is.
Somebody, I think Charlie James said, it's too bad we have to define it as reaction, but in a way it is. It's exactly what I just said, a reaction to what was going on. And how could you put Humpty Dumpty back together again? And he'd already fallen off the wall big time. And so I've always wanted the job to make pavilions in the front yards of the glass boxes, like the Apple store. But in fact, I was given a job about the same time as the Portland building from Best Products. They were a discount house, and they did crazy buildings, and so they had a group of architects that were going to show them cinema art, these buildings. But I made a loggia, and I made it all around the parking, so they could have flea markets all weekend long around, because that's what it was shopping. And that's one way to glorify shopping. And back to Venturi, another way is to do what Bob does. I mean, he glorifies it with signs and accepts the stuff that is a kind of visual nightmare and makes it something that is artful and the way he looks at it. For me, using the loggia there for shopping on weekends, like flea markets, is a bit highfalutin, I suppose, in his world of what he would do in Las Vegas. What else is it? It's easy to say what it's not and what all of you are doing, and what I did and am still doing is postmodern, because I think the 3 of us would agree that if SEOM, Congress of Modern Architects, Corbusier, Gideon, and so on, defined what a modern ethos would bring, it had to do with the way buildings were put together. It had to do with shorter work weeks. It had to do with light and air and ventilation. It had to do with a lot of good things as Corb saw them. But when somebody builds a reflective glass box on Park Avenue, that has nothing to do with those tenants. And therefore, for me, you called it something else, but I always called it commercial modernism. But you just said something else, with normative modernism. But those don't follow the same lessons that the Village Schwab and the other houses of early Corp did. This gets us a little bit into something that is worrisome. When Sarah has come over to talk, we've talked both times a little bit about the zeitgeist. And this is really tricky territory. The zeitgeist being the spirit of the age. And when I was at Harvard, I was taught history by none other than the black monster, Sacred Gideon, who said that we could only be modern, we could only work in the modern age. It was our duty, our right, our moral responsibility. I mean, it was that kind of thing. When I was in studio at Harvard, Jose Luis and Roget, somehow long gone, and Sarah had taken over. Sarah had worked for Le Corbusier. And Sarah brought me into his office and said, Mr. Mays, Harvard's been here since 1626. And I've been here for 6 years. And you've been here, as far as I know, for about 6 minutes. And if you want to stay, you will do. And he didn't say it, but he wanted to say, you will do good. And so I had to stop doing whatever, if I wanted to get through. And I knew my parents wanted me to get through. It would have looked very bad on my leg. I had been at the University of Cincinnati where if you didn't do these, you went home. But those were our father figures at the time, and that's what you did. And that's what they thought they were doing. That's what SOM thought they were doing. They thought the glass boxes were a version of Nice. They didn't know what to do with Russia. They just were thrown overboard. After the war, the language changed before. But anyway, the zeitgeist and doing what your society, what's happening today, and how can you tell as an artist where to go by what you do? Does it reflect today? How is that? Certainly, the technology of what you do as a student or as an architect today is reflective of your time. There's only one person I know here who insists on building a compressive strength building, building block by block by block. And he's doing that for the prints. But that doesn't happen in today's world. Then you say, do I let the technology, whether it's the computer and what it allows you to do, or steel and concrete, what it allows you to do or not allow you to do, does that read in the building? Or could you make a decorated shed? And we feed each other this I won't say garbage. We feed each other the line that we have to be reflective of today. And therefore, you get into the argument about a figure like Bobstead. On one hand, he makes an old-timey building, and then he does a modern office building, and then he does a house on Martha's Vineyard, which is quite cozy and nice. And then he does something slick in Houston. And you say, no, he has got no moral fiber. You can't do that. You simply can't do it. Well, I would say, does he make a good house in Martha's Vineyard? Or does he make a good office building in Houston? Or, did he make a good Richard Meier, or did he make a good Bobstead? I don't know, but I kind of find it difficult to say there's only one way to make architecture. And that you said, Stan, that when people came here, they came here because of me, but I came here because of John Labattu, and it was close to New York. And Labattu was one I knew that wasn't like Sarah. He was still holding court at Harvard. And he wasn't like Rudolph, who was then the dean at Yale. But I knew that Labattu had trained and was training Charles Moore and had trained Bob Tudor. And I thought, well, there's quite a distance between those two, and neither one of them, that's not what's happening today. Maybe there was a little leakage of Lucan or something like that. That was a big influence. But what I like about Sarah's teaching is that she has an open mind. So she's always ready to argue, but she knows it's not. And she isn't one who's going to say it has to be this way. So it's that I find lacking in all my friends know that this terrible man, I don't know, Nikolai Borisov, who has one way of seeing. Where we came from, not a terribly good critic, Paul Berger, but somebody who said, if Peter Eisman makes a building and I'm reviewing it, I want to know if that's a good Peter Eisman building, because I know the tenants of Peter Eisman, so I'm not going to ask for him to be Gunnar Asplund, and so on. Or Meyer, Gary. I remember sitting in a meeting in New York, and it was Easter morning, and I was the only one in the room, about 6 or 8 architects who celebrated Easter. Frank Gehry had just read the New York Times review of a little pavilion he had made in Washington. Great pavilion. Is this negative? I got it. I said, Frank, it's not negative, it's a B+.